Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to All Core Devs 148 after basically a month off. Um, we have a bunch of stuff to cover today. I think the main thing I hope we can get through is basically just getting a view from the different client teams around, where they're at generally, what they see as priorities going forward for Shanghai. So we've had a bunch of time async and in person at DEF CON and in other ways to just like discuss all the potential EIPs, all the stuff that's been CFI'd a while back. And so I think it's valuable to just take time to go over, how each team kind of sees that so far. Related to Shanghai, I think there's also two specific topics beyond the actual EIPs themselves that are worth covering. So one is just how we do the fork activation. So we discussed this a little bit in Bogota, but basically, how we want to trigger the fork, and there's different implications there. And then there's a DevNet that's already been stood up for some Shanghai stuff, so it'll be worth covering that as well. And I think then if we get through that, we still have time. There's a couple other sort of important topics that aren't directly related to Shanghai, but around the engine API, a new ETH protocol version, and all the issues we've been seeing around Gordy. And so if we can get through all that, it'll be a good call. I guess, just to kick this off, from the EL side first, like, does any client team just want to kind of share, over the past month, as you've looked at like all the stuff we could be doing next, what do you think are like the priorities? What do you see as like important, and where you would like us to focus on?
Okay, I can start with
Okay.
Nethermind update
Yeah.
and our review. So we have the draft or merge PRs for all candidates for inclusion for Shanghai. Of course, we are testing and reviewing them. We also implemented the activating self-destruct and transient storage opcodes. So far, we synced Shandong testnet yesterday. We ran and passed Ethereum EOF tests. If it's about withdrawals, we need to adjust them to the latest spec implemented on our site and check with Marius test vectors. About priorities, my viewpoint is that current candidates for inclusion are good choices for the next hard fork. If we added something big, we would delay withdrawals for sure, and I believe we don't want to. And we can work in parallel on other EIPs. Maybe perhaps I would consider adding small EIPs like deactivating self-destruct. That is my opinion.
Got it. Thanks. Lucas, I see you have your hand up as well.
If I can weigh in on one thing,
Yeah.
so in my opinion, the biggest priority right now is to define scope of Shanghai in the next, hopefully, 4 weeks or something, so we can plan accordingly to that and move accordingly to that. So that's probably the biggest priority of all.
Right, yeah. And on that note, I guess I was talking a little bit about this before we went live to some people. I think at a high level today, if we can sort of work through what all the client teams see as like priorities, what their current views are. And then on the next call, there's obviously a bunch of like EIP champions that have stuff proposed. We can make that call sort of the main one for people to come and advocate for those. And my hope is like the call after that, so like 4 weeks from today, we sort of have a pretty clean list for Shanghai that doesn't move. So we should have like probably an idea today of like, if there's stuff that every single client team thinks is important, then it probably makes sense to move forward for that. But then, in the next call or two, we can sort out all the potential additions. But yeah, I think every client team I've spoken with has like echoed that like getting almost even more importantly than like what the list is, getting a sort of finalized list for Shanghai in the next month or so is really important to allocate resources. Anything else from Nethermind?
No, I think that is all.
Okay, thanks. Andrew, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I agree with Marek. I think the current list, the current CFI list is a good one, and I would add to it the self-destruct deactivation IP 4758. It will simplify at least Aragon's code base significantly. And it's also a prerequisite for workload trees.
Thanks. Peter?
So from the Get team's perspective, we had a little debate on how we kind of view Shanghai and what we view as important one. And essentially, if you look at the Shanghai and the proposals, there are a few big proposals to get included and a few smaller ones. On the smaller ones, like for example, disabling the self-destruct is or the transient storage, I think those are relatively, so from an implementation perspective, they are not in quotes relevant because they are relatively simple to implement. There, the effort is mostly about making sure that they work correctly. So it's probably the testing effort is more significant. So we're kind of on these smaller features. I think our opinion is that yeah, whatever people would like to go with, we can definitely go with. Although we do support getting rid of the self-destruct, that would be super nice to do as soon as possible. However, on the bigger features, within the team, we kind of have a few champions for three specific features. Live client is, well, the withdrawals is something that people kind of take for granted that is going to get included in Shanghai. So that's definitely being worked on actively by Lifetime, by Matt. And as for another two main features, one of them is, which was brought up quite a lot on in DevCon, was 4844. And for if anybody missed those 4844 workshops, it might be a bit of a larger task to tackle. But at least on the execution layer, it's a relatively simple and straightforward EIP, and it would allow a lot of scalability. So we would really like to have that included in Shanghai. At least Marius and myself are kind of pushing towards that direction. Also, the E68 update that we proposed is going on the same path. And as for the third large feature set, Martin would really like to champion the EOF stuff. So that one I'm slightly on the bench with, as I'd really like to see some. So there, I guess the two possibilities of getting that included is one of them is just getting EOF support without any actual use case, which the rationale behind it is to try to keep it to minimal, the changes. Another rationale is to get the UF in with some actual new use cases. I'm fine with going with a minimal approach too, if we can actually define these future use cases in advance. So as long as we know what we want them to enable, I think that's also fine. So kind of that's the stake of that's how the Get team kind of sees Shanghai. And yes, these three larger features are kind of, it can, so generally we as core devs overall kind of suck at shipping new features, but it might be interesting to try and get more than one big feature through, since we also suck at shipping hard forks. So it's it might be interesting to find somewhat a middle ground between how many stuff we add and how rarely we ship hard forks.
Yeah, okay, there's a ton of hands up, but thanks for that, Peter. That's really a helpful perspective. Matt from Besu, I think you were next.
Yeah, no, and we have a little bit of a different opinion, but at the same time, I think what Netherminds put out was pretty much in line with what we were looking at. We have some of the candidate PRs from the list pretty much wrapped up besides testing. Our perspective is that it really depends on the complexity of 4844, whether we want to include that. We haven't done enough scoping to understand fully on our side. But the rest of the candidates on the list, maybe with the exception of EOF, should be relatively straightforward for our team. So, I think EOF warrants a little more discussion, to Peter's point. But other than that, the only kind of unknown is what the actual complexity of 4844 will be in terms of what we need to implement and test. And also with the consensus layer side, do we want, how will that look in terms of delaying the features that we would ship in Shanghai, or at least, complicating that question? So that was kind of where our team landed. But yeah, it's definitely okay with the rest of the candidates on the list, and already have a lot of that in flight. Also for including the things like transient storage and self-destruct also are on board with that, especially considering that, with transient storage, a lot of the implementations are already written. So I think that we should just, push for those kind of lower stakes things, as long as, again, to Peter's point, the testing is thorough and understood.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Lucas, you were next. Lucas, then Marius, and Andrew.
Yeah, I want to weigh in on proto-dunk sharding for 844.
Yeah.
So we had a big discussion yesterday about it, and there were some concerns. So first concern is that the scope isn't finalized. The spec is really still evolving, and we are afraid that it will go in a way that, like the merge, that some minor things were changed up to the last moment. Well, not up to the last moment, but quite far into the pipeline, and it created a lot of tension. It created a lot of uncertainty on some things for us. So if we want to include them, I would like to have the spec finalized in a month, and then in the next month, and then we can take a final decision based on the scope, because that was the biggest unknown to us, how big would be the final scope, and we see that as a problematic, and we don't want to commit to something that might change in the future, etc., before the actual release, and potentially even postpone Shanghai itself. And we would like to get withdrawals out of the window sooner. So yeah, those are our concerns on 4844, that still developed in terms of spec a lot.
Got it. Oh, yeah, Peter.
Very, very slightly, sorry. 4844 is not the proto-dunk sharding. That's built on top. That's something after that. 4844 is just the block transactions.
Okay. So I'm not championing that, so I might be a little bit confused here.
I think the 4844 still has some moving parts on the spec. And Ansgar, maybe Ansgar, you commented a couple times about this, but do you want to give maybe an update of where things are at with the spec, and what do you expect we can get done in the next month or so?
Right. I think that only partially, but maybe it's good enough. So I think basically there was one more moving piece from a couple of weeks ago, the fee market, that's done. There's only one small question left, but I'm very confident we can resolve it in the next 4 weeks. There's also a very some small uncertainty left around the specifics on the cryptography side. There might be one additional parameter that the precompile is supposed to return. So very small changes there. I don't think. Yeah, I basically think it would be very reasonable to come to a spec freeze within the next month or so. There might be some more moving parts on the kind of the networking spec side. I'm not 100% certain about that. So if someone else on the call could talk to that. That's not my area of expertise.
And I think maybe the other parts that we could probably see moving is some constants. So from an implementation perspective, it's probably not a huge change, but say, the actual blob size or the retention period on the CL, deciding, whether it's 500K or 256K. So those constants, I suspect, could probably still change as we do more testing, but it shouldn't alter the implementations significantly, I guess.
Right, and I don't specifically see a reason why. If we wanted to, I think we could also make more or less final decisions on that within the next 4 weeks or
Right.
so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Like I don't think there would be an issue with still changing them at a later point. But if there was strong desire to just make final calls soon, I think we could do that.
Okay, back to the raise hands. Marius.
Yes. So I have some issues with EOF that I would like to discuss. I actually quite like it. The only problem I see is that the state EOF is in right now with the proposed EAPs, it doesn't actually help us with anything. And so we would need to, for EOF to be really useful, in my opinion, we would need to get rid of the jump test analysis and maybe also have the stack validation. And so we need to put like have another hard fork with at least 2 EIPs. The problem is that contracts that are deployed now between now and real EOF or like the useful EOF could still have code that is not that doesn't have these validations in place. So we would have at least 3 versions of the EVM. We would have the normal version, we would have EOF version 1, which has the EIPs in that we have right now, and then we would need to have EOF version 2, which has like the full validation and getting rid of the jump test analysis. The problem is that we need to maintain 3 different versions with 3 different like kind of security guarantees. And if we change something across all versions, like, I don't know, repricing an opcode, then we would need to maintain 6 versions of it all of a sudden. And the problem I see is like we can very easily shoot ourselves in the foot with this. And I would really like to see the full version of EOF going in. The problem with that is I don't see us realistically doing the full version of EOF within a couple of months. And so the way I thought about it, or the way I would propose, would be to delay EOF and really focus on withdrawals and bank sharding, and then get EOF in a hard fork after Shanghai. I know that's like it's not it's a bit contrarian to what others have said, but I just don't want us to shoot ourselves in the foot again with this and then having to maintain something. And the thing is, like, with old hard forks, we can eventually, with history expiry, we can eventually get rid of these rules. But with EOF, we can never get rid of them because there will always be contracts on the different versions. So we will need to maintain the different versions of the EVM indefinitely.
Thanks. Yeah, there was a couple comments in the chats about the EOF. Yeah, Thomas, do you want to go next? And then if we have Alex from the EOF EIP, we can do him after.
Yeah, so my proposal is a bit unusual. So I was thinking that EOF is definitely a right direction and something that I fully support, although I wouldn't like to see it being rushed to mainnet. Still, I think it requires a lot of testing, and people would possibly be able to test it in parallel to many other changes, and almost like the EOF can be parallelized in the work streams because EVM itself is very independent from many other changes that we work on. So proposal is to actually either build a testnet or include EOF on the testnets, Ethereum testnets with versioning, and keep improving the versions of that one until we find a version that we're happy with, and only then push that change to the mainnet, which would lead to testnets, Ethereum testnets, to be not entirely consistent with the mainnet, however, only for the smart contracts that would be on different versions. So you would say that, I'm not sure if we would have to limit those versions of EVM to only interact with other contracts with the same version for the sake of testnet, not to cause additional trouble. But this is the idea. Then we can over time collect everything that is needed for EOF to have its final form, and whatever version it will be, version 5, version 6, then say this is the version that goes to mainnet.
Right. Then I guess there's two ways you can do this, either on a new test net if you don't want to, if you want to break things a bit more, or have the existing test nets. Yeah. Alex, do you want to give an update from the Epsilon side, and just, your perspective as like championing EOF of what you think could be like a good approach here? I don't know if you have a mic though. No.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe just like a brief update. The reason we split them into different EIPs initially was due to the idea was that it would be much more easy to review, those changes in isolation. But even when we started with the first version, our goal was to get this full feature set, which the 5 EIPs accomplish. And one of the main goals of that is to also get rid of dynamic jumps. Then the last 2 EIPs, well, there's one EIP, the very last one, which is the stack validation, that I kind of consider as optional. It just simplifies the EVM implementations, but it doesn't give like a user visible feature. It could speed up the EVM, but that's about it. However, if you skip that, then we likely would skip it forever, because that would mean a version bump. And regarding I guess in terms of like maturity of the changes, the first one is of course 3540 and 3670. Those basically define the structure. Those, I believe, have been, or at least have had some kind of a review already. Obviously not like a merge ready review, but I think that there were more eyes at it and implementations in multiple clients exist for those. Then the following one was the static jump. I think that change is relatively simple, in that I don't think that there would be any changes to that feature. However, the biggest one is the function sections, which hasn't received too much attention from core devs so far. So that's the only bottleneck in getting this fully accepted. We do have implementations of that I believe, in 2 EVMs, but obviously it's not covered in like as much as the other changes are. And then lastly, we wanted to change these last 3 EIPs to review status from draft, because we don't really expect too many changes in them before DEFCON, but that just fell through the cracks. And we have been in discussion with the Solidity team regarding the usage of all of these changes. And Daniel responded to some extent on the research Discord to state the viewpoint of Solidity. I think that's all I can really say. From our perspective, we would prefer to have the full set in one go. I think the stack validation, as I mentioned, the very last EIP, that can be debated whether to include or not, but the others, I would say, should go into in a single set.
And when you say single set, I mean, you know, would you
in a
rather have?
single protocol update.
Yeah, but would you rather so say that like the trade-off was like sort of this minimal EOF that we have now in Shanghai versus the whole thing in like the fork after? Do you think it's better to delay to have the whole thing, or is yeah? Because we're sort of in this in between uh in between state now where we've like CFI'd the first half of it, not the whole thing. Um, yeah, so I'm curious, like, do you also think like even if it requires a delay, having them all together is better, or having this like subset ASAP is actually valuable if we can't get the whole thing?
I would say even the subset is valuable, but obviously way less than the full set.
Got it.
The preferred outcome would be having all of it in Shanghai, of course.
Yeah. Got it. Thanks. That's really helpful. Yeah, go ahead, Maris.
Quick question for Alex. What's the status of like the support in Solidity for it? Is it like all going to be supported? Is it something that Solidity wants or is going to support? And what about other languages? Like I don't want to do the simple subroutine thing again, right? Where the language devs say we're not going to support this.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's an overlap between the people in Epsilon and Solidity. And so the discussions were more, more close. There is an implementation of most of the features except of the function sections in Solidity. But it's on the to-do list for us to actually implement it. Besides that, we had discussions with some other language teams, including the Huff team, and they were interested in actually supporting the function sections as is. But Solidity itself, I mean, they had nothing against it, of course. Yeah, I don't think there were any blockers. It is seen as a useful feature, generally.
Yeah, and we had Daniel from the Solidity team comment on Discord yesterday. He can't make, I don't think he's on the call. Yeah, no, and he couldn't make the call, but I pasted his thoughts in the Zoom chat here. Okay, Andrew, and Denkrad, you've had your hands up for a while, so yeah, Andrew.
I agree with Marius. I think it's better to implement all EOF changes in one go with the goal of disabling dynamic jumps. And I also agree with Thomas that it's kind of almost an independent chunk of work, and we can probably have a separate testnet for it. So I would think about EOF changes as a dedicated EOF hard fork, which might happen after Cancun or with Cancun or whatnot, but kind of try to think about enabling two sets of hard forks, Cancun and EOF1. And then that's when we have everything ready for EOF, we just synchronize on whether it goes with Cancun or after or before. And I have two additional concerns about EOF. First one, as far as I understand it, we need to pick between EP 2315 and 4750 because they both deal with functions, so that should be resolved with which one of them goes. And my second concern is whether EOF will help or hinder code chunking in workcode trees. So maybe someone knowledgeable about workcode trees, perhaps Guillaume, could double check that EOF doesn't hinder Verco or even helps potentially. So yeah, I would extract all EOF work into a separate dedicated hard fork.
Yeah, and there's a comment by Alex saying it doesn't hinder chunking and that they worked on it before vertical trees. Anything else you want to add on that front, Alex?
Yeah, so basically the headers and yeah, all the headers are upfront, so they would be in the first chunk in the vertical trees, and everything else would be in subsequent chunks. And I believe the first chunk, well, the first like 128 chunks are cheaper anyway. And so I think it works well with vertical trees.
Don't we have to align to somehow ensure that boundaries between code sections like don't play nicely with code chunks? So what if your code section is split between two code chunks, or if somehow your code chunk is in the middle of intermediate value, like push data, whatnot. So is it a problem at all? Some kind of misalignment between code section boundaries and code chunks?
I don't think so. So in the code chunking, regular EVM code, you need to know the code offset, which is taking up 1 byte of each chunk because of jump test analysis. Now you wouldn't need that in EOF. You may need to load the first chunk with the headers, but then you can calculate all the offsets based off that. And I don't think there would be any downside effect beyond that.
Cool.
Greg messaged me to say he couldn't raise his hand up, but he had a comment about your point around like 2315 versus EOF. Greg, do you want to take a minute to talk about that?
Unmute. Can people hear me?
Yep.
Don't know if my mic is working.
No, it's
okay. 2015 is simpler than the 4750 functions and the other surrounding stuff. Gives slightly less security guarantees rather than saying that all functions take a specified number of arguments and return a specified number of arguments. It simply proves that all functions, that the same functions everywhere it's called takes the same number of arguments and returns the same number of arguments. So it's simpler, but if we're going with the full suite of EOF, I will happily withdraw 2315 in favor of EOF, and I very much support the full suite of EOF. I also support getting it in sooner rather than later because I've got work I'm doing that I cannot go live with until I'm able to traverse the control flow graph of EVM code in linear time and space, and until I can generate machine code from byte code in linear time and space. So we have to get rid of dynamic jumps and replace them with subroutines. And I've been trying to do this for years. So every month that we delay it delays the ability to compile byte code to machine code. We delay it for months, we delay it for years. So it's really so close to ready to go. So I'm getting frustrated by these constant delays. We couldn't get it in before the merge. We couldn't do it during the merge, and I'll quit whining. That's all. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah. And okay, that's good to know though that the 2315 can sort of be superseded by 4750 if we go that route. Dankrad, you've had your hand up also for a really long time.
Sure, yeah. So I only have a very small comment on EOF because I'm definitely not an expert on this, but I kind of feel like I want to add to like basically Marius's feeling that like having a minimal version seems not ideal to me, because reserving an extra version seems a very high cost, because it has to be maintained forever, and it will also be an extra version with every upgrade of the EVM that comes orthogonal to this, like opcode changes and so on, that will not be reflected in EOF versions. So yeah, that's just my small comment on EOF. I also feel like it should be much more of like trying to make the first version something that's really worthwhile. And the second small comment I had was with regards to Lucas on API changes. What I wanted to say is, I think like actually this is on 4844. So I think what actually it is true that there are still small changes going on right now, but they are like what, at least, okay, so there's one on the fee market, I guess, but otherwise, so what's happening on the cryptography API, so the high level of that is actually completely settled. The only thing that that is happening right now is like something that would be deep in the library, and so I think it actually doesn't affect client teams implementing this at all. So they can work with the current API as it is.
Got it. Thanks.
Yep, that's it for me.
Thanks. And I guess, yeah, we also have a couple folks from CL teams on the calls. I see some Teku Lighthouse folks, and I don't see everyone. Grandine, I'll presume, yeah, so I guess they're probably all here. But I'd be curious to just hear like quickly from the different CL teams, like, you know, after hearing all of this, what's like your general view on things, and yeah, I don't know, I can pick on Paul if you want Lighthouse to go first.
Hey, sure. Thanks, Tim. I think mostly from what Shanghai involves for us is just withdrawals in the IP 4844. So we're of the opinion that withdrawals needs to go in. So I think that's a given for us. 4844, still a little bit on the fence. I think we probably need a little bit more data, mainly around how it's going to affect the network before we can make a call on it. But I'm keen to work towards making a call. We're implementing both of them. I think something useful from our perspective is that we're keen to see 4844 always built on top of withdrawals when we're doing test nets, but I think that's already a given. Yeah, that's all I have to say on the matter.
Thanks. Terrence?
Yep. Hey, everyone. So with Prism, we definitely agree with Paul that withdraw is a must, but withdraw is also less complicated, much simpler. I believe that we should have a DevNet in the next 1 to 2 weeks, so that's very exciting to see. Also, 4844, we have the luxury of like Coinbase and Optimism contributing, so we're kind of like more like on the luckier side, I guess. But yeah, so I mean, for us, I think we still remain very bullish for including 4844. I think the unknown here is first is the bandwidth concern, is the size of the target and max. I think like with testing, we can get into a pretty good idea on what we should use. But even I think today 1 megabyte, 2 megabytes is just too big. I think we can lower it to 256 and 512. I think at the minimum that's going to dramatically reduce the concern. And then another one is KCG ceremony, and I think that's being worked on right now. So I'm definitely curious to hear more on the timeline.
Yeah, there was a comment about the KCG ceremony. Trent, do you want to give a quick update on that before we go to other CL teams?
Yeah, was this in the chat or what's the context?
Wondering what's the current timeline for the KCG ceremony?
Oh, yeah, sure. So we have an audit with Sigma Prime, which starts in a couple weeks, November 7th. That'll run for a little bit, and then we hope to wrap everything up and have it launched by late November. We're working with the Ethereum.org team to tighten up the website. In the past, collaborated with the PSE team, but now we're getting to a point where it's in a good place, and once it's publicly launched, it will run for about 2 months, give or take. We want to make sure there's enough time for as many people as possible to participate, but yeah, that's the general timeline is should launch before the end of November.
And as I understand it, we only need the final input or output of the ceremony for like mainnet. So like even if when say we even had the test nets go live with 4844, but if we don't have the output of the ceremony, then you could just plug in the different number when we move to mainnet, and it doesn't really change anything implementation wise. Is that right?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, but maybe
Yeah.
somebody else with better understanding can jump in. But yeah.
Yeah. Dankrat, I don't know if you're still here, but that might be helpful to know, like, when do we need the final output, basically?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's really just, it's a file with a list of constants. So yeah, like, I mean, basically, definitely before the mainnet hard fork, but I mean, I think even if it were, yeah, like just at the time of the client release, it would be fine. Like there's nothing new to test. Like the cryptography works exactly the same, whether that's like some testing version or if it's a final trust setup.
Got it. Thanks.
And yeah, I'm also very optimistic that it will be very easily done by then. I think the team is working very hard on that, and I think it will be fine.
Got it. Any other folks from the CL side want to just share their perspective?
We can also just take the testnet ceremony output for like testing, so that we have some realistically looking.
Right. Yeah. Phil?
Yeah, so basically for us at Lodestar, we echo the same sort of comments from Terrence. We're also getting good positive support from some of the other contributors. So there were some things that were addressed in terms of blockers in the 4844 calls, but other than that, they are being addressed. So I am optimistic with 4844 and of course withdrawals.
Got it. Any other CL folks?
Yeah, Teku here. We definitely have the vision that withdrawal will be easier compared to 4844. So we are discussing internally that we might prefer to have them separate and having the withdrawal first and then 4844 later. Also to have some chance to do other time for doing some cleanups and refinement with all the things that we already have for the merge. So having some time also to settle down and have better things in place would help instead of continuously adding stuff. But this is the these are our comments.
Got it. Before we go to Ansgar, is there any other CL team?
Yeah, so for the Grenadier team, I think unless something serious will show up on the testnets that will block any of these two features, withdrawals or 4844, I think that would be nice to have the next upgrade.
Got it. Thanks. I think that's everyone. Okay. Ansgar?
I just wanted to add on the topic of like focal conflicts because if you have
your mic is not
kind
working.
Can you?
Sort of.
I'll just post some chat.
Okay. Yeah, I'll read it from the chat. And okay, so there's another comment by Alex in the chat around, there's sort of this implicit assumption of like, there's a high cost to each upgrade, and that means we need to do big upgrades. But would it be simpler to like potentially have more smaller upgrades and quicker rollouts? I guess, yeah. Peter, yeah.
Yeah, so we try to do that since Shanghai, and Shanghai, the DEFCON Shanghai, and it always failed. So it sounds, in theory, it sounds nice to have quicker, more frequent rollouts, but in practice, it takes us forever to test a hard fork. Generally, clients are kind of lagging on implementing stuff, so we always have to wait until everybody picks up their thing and just rolls with it. And then we somehow need to debate on, okay, let's fork one testnet, let's fork the other testnet, let's wait until it survives. Does it survive? Okay, we're tweaking again, we need to test again. And it's just this very long procedure. And it actually makes sense that it's long because you don't really want to mess it up. But that kind of also entails that it doesn't matter whether you do frequent hard forks or rare hard forks, you always need 2 to 3 months of just wasting time rolling it out. So if we do three small hard forks, that still entails 9 months of, or at least 6 months of extra useless time, so to say. So it's kind of a balance as to, I would say that sometimes it's worth to cram in one more feature than to wait it out.
Thanks, Marius.
Yeah. So what what really convinced me of this was in Bogota, Peter said that I think it was something around the lines. If we were to push for withdrawals, only withdrawals, and maybe some the current CFI stuff, then we can probably have a hard fork in February, March. And so for 844, will probably come in like September or something. But if we put it both together and do everything, when we have one big hard fork, then it might be June or July, and so we will save 2 or 3 months if we put them together. It's yeah, just it's more realistic to have these bigger things. I don't like it. I would also prefer like smaller hard forks because it's easier to test. But the bigger hard forks are just way easier because we need so much time to roll it out to the community. We need everyone to update their nodes and everything. So that's where the most time is spent.
Right. So I guess to summarize kind of all of this, it feels like withdrawals is like a given across everyone. Oh, okay, sorry. So do we want to comment on why Berlin and London came so quickly? I think the reason for that is like basically we had really started the work on 1559 in advance, so while Berlin was still happening, and then Berlin had like a relatively long rollout period across the multiple test nets, and I think during that period we did manage to get like clients to start working on London in sort of parallel as we were waiting for Berlin to happen. So I think, yeah, it's possible to have forks follow each other and to like use this sort of down period as a way to like start implementing more stuff in clients. That it did feel like it was like, pushing people a bit at the time, and there was the difficulty bomb and all of that. But I don't think it's impossible. And maybe the other difference is it was only EL teams, so the coordination was like slightly less. So it might be, it might still be possible to do something like that. But yeah, I wouldn't say it was like trivial to do either. Yeah. And I guess, yeah, to kind of go back into what I was saying, like at a high level, it seems like every single team is sort of on board with withdrawals being a part of Shanghai. I haven't heard anyone mention anything about all of the small kind of other CFI EIPs, but from like conversations with client teams and the testing teams in the past months, it doesn't seem like there's any opposition or like, or that there are a ton of work. So like the stuff around like the warm Coinbase, the push zero, limiting and metering init code. It seems like most teams have either a PR in progress or can easily make one there. So it seems like that's kind of a pretty solid set we have. Then there's probably like 3 buckets that we've discussed. So first, EOF, whether we want to have it as it's currently specified, have it as a bigger kind of bundle with everything coming together, and if we make that bigger bundle, whether it should go in Shanghai or not. Then the second bucket is obviously 4844. So I think there's some concerns about like how ready it is and how big of a change it is relative to everything else. And then the third bucket that's worth mentioning is I think every EL team has mentioned that like removing self-destruct is something they would like to consider. And then 1153 is sort of mentioned here and there as well. So I guess like at a high level, between these things, is there any client team that feels like there's a big thing missing there, or is the sort of like withdrawals plus all the small stuff, 4844, EOFs, and then self-destruct, 1153, kind of the big things? Andrew, I see you just raise your hand.
Yeah, I think just a small comment about 1153. I think it's nice to have, but it's not as urgent as to be considered for Shanghai. That's my 2 cents.
Okay. Marius?
Sorry, I just had my hand up. But same thing. I also think 1153 is not that important.
Okay. Oh, and Ansgar, you're against self-destruct. Do you want to share why? I don't know if your mic is working now.
I can give a quick argument, which is that there are contracts that depend on it and will break. And we historically have tried very hard not to break people.
Right.
And not just gas tokens, like actual people using it from a long time ago.
Yeah, and I think, as I understand it, the breakage that would be introduced for self-destruct with the specific EIP. So the EIP doesn't remove it; it converts it to send all, which sends all of the ETH back to the caller, but doesn't destroy the contract. There's one pattern that breaks, which is using like create two and then self-destructing contracts and re-instantiating a different contract at the same address. I think that's basically the main one. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
But that's also real anti-pattern, and we need to remove this opcode. We need to remove it anyway. It's just not like that's the fact. And the earlier we do, the less people actually write software with this weird pattern in mind. And so I would be for removing it as soon as possible. So like there will be some people that are bricked by this. And it's unfortunate. But I think the longer we wait with removing this, the more people will actually shoot themselves in the foot with this.
I don't think that latter thing is true. I think basically, from what I've seen and heard, there's basically one legitimate contract that actually used this pattern, and it was a long time ago. And since then, everybody's been advised not to, and no one has since. And this person did it before that advice was popularized. And so, if we are going to break self-destruct eventually, then now versus later seems inconsequential. But that is a very big decision to make, I think, to declare that we are going to break a legitimate immutable contract that is on chain, not upgradable, and it's not going to work anymore.
Andrew, you have your hand up?
I think self-destruct, like removing self-destruct, is critical for simplifying the code and to allow in Verkle. But I would suggest, if we want to consider some kind of maybe transitional measures or not breaking contracts in the analysis by who did it? Maybe Jupiter, I think there was some analysis done some time ago. They identified one contract, Pine Core from Pine Finance, and there they say one possible solution is to allow self-destructing a contract if it was created in the same transaction. So I would say I would say that we should declare our intention to remove self-destruct in Shanghai, and with the default option just to turn it into send all. But if somebody screams like between now and the next call that, oh, absolutely, you will ruin my contract, then we should discuss how to like possible solution. But if nobody screams, then maybe it's not that important and we should proceed.
Just for context, someone is already screaming. That's why I'm like, I actually want to get rid of self-destruct, but on the same time, there is someone out there who is saying this will guaranteed break my thing that I deployed 5 years ago.
If we only allow this particular scenario when a contract is self-destructed in the same transaction, then I guess it's fine because it doesn't entail, it's kind of a virtual self-destruct, and it doesn't entail an unlimited database deletion. So I think we could consider such limited mitigation, but people should definitely raise their concerns now, and then we should discuss them. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Peter?
So just there has been some discussions on the chat about why or why not remove self-destruct. And I wanted just to emphasize one use case where really self-destruct is really bothersome, specifically that self-destruct has a fixed gas cost. However, if you have a client that implements proper pruning, disk pruning, then in theory I could just self-destruct the Forsage contract if the contract would have a self-destruct, and that would entail deleting gigabytes of state data from one block to the next. Essentially, the work required to execute that operation would be insane. And then the only hacky solution is that, well, if this contract is huge, then what? Yeah, okay, we're not going to prune it. Yeah, tough luck. That's it. And that's essentially how our code currently works. And that's kind of bad. And the point is that if self-destruct becomes a no-op, then so essentially self-destruct is one of the last remaining operations where you have a fixed gas cost, but it can entail an unlimited storage cost for a pruning client. And that's what we would like to avoid, not to have these unlimited, unbounded vectors.
Thanks. Guillaume?
Yeah, so I indeed talked to someone in Bogota that approached me about this specific topic, and like Andrew said, it would be nice to be able to have a special case that if during the creation contract, like the creation transaction, someone calls self-destruct, then it should be able to, it should not affect the state, and therefore it should be allowed. The only problem with this is that in the Verkle tree context, you would still need to add an indicator that this address was missing before. So I'm sympathetic to this request of making self-destruct like behave differently if the contract is deleted in the same transaction that is created. But there's a lot of complexity involved with this, and we should not make this decision, take this decision lightly.
Yeah. Oh, there's another comment in the chat is that it can force Ether into contracts that are non-payable.
I believe the current proposal would still allow for that because we're just changing it to send all.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I see. So if you do send all, but then or self-destruct today, but then the address is a non-payable contract. Yeah, withdrawals can do this as well. Oh, Peter, is your hand up again?
Yes, I just wanted to add, I think somebody also mentioned it, but I just wanted to emphasize and reiterate that if we can identify one to a handful of contracts that are legitimate and get broken, then I think it's perfectly fine to have to special case them. I mean, we already have the right remedy contract special case in the yellow paper, it's super ugly, but we can actually surgically fix the few issues that remain. So it's kind of strange. We don't really want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So if self-destruct is obviously bad, and it would be obviously better to get rid of it, except that two contracts, maybe we can just have a solution for those two contracts instead of doing a completely different generic solution that happens to work for them too.
Right. I guess though the challenge with that is it's almost like what we did with EOF. You probably need to first band deploying new contracts using the opcode, and then you need to retroactively sort of analyze the cases. So clearly, yeah, it seems like, this is a direction people generally want to go in. There's a lot of like edge cases and uncertainty. I I don't know if someone wants to, I guess, try to investigate those in the next few weeks so that we can have a clearer picture. Because it seems like including, making the current EIP CFI as is doesn't give us like enough unless we wanted to explicitly break, those contracts. And I think there's clearly some concerns there. So yeah, is there anyone who'd want to like look into this more in the next few weeks to see if we can come up with, proper solution and something that we can then consider for Shanghai? Because I think as is, it's probably underspecified. Okay, Jared says he can look into this. Thanks, Jared. So, yeah, I guess for this one, we can just discuss it further once we have a better idea. It's good to just start talking about it so people get aware that this might happen. And so, yeah, so that's something they should watch out for. And I guess, yeah, back to like so it seems like the two other big buckets are basically what do we do about EOF? How do we approach 4844? I think so for EOF, there was this idea of like having a special test net to see if we can like get it implemented, narrowing down like a version which has kind of support for all of the operations. And then, some people seem to think this is realistic for Shanghai. Some people disagree, but is that something that would be worth doing? Like trying to set up a sort of 4844 DevNet, which we gradually, add, or we sort of specify what's like the minimum set of features that we think are valuable for like a full EOF. So beyond what's already CFI'd. And see, if clients can implement this. I guess a bit like what we're doing with 4844 in parallel. Yeah, I'm curious to hear from EL teams. Like, okay, Ansgar disagrees that if we want this for Shanghai, we have time to do a special test net. Yeah, curious to hear from others.
Well, we already have a special test net mostly for UF.
Oh, that's the Shandong one.
Yeah, it doesn't have withdrawals on it.
And so what? Yeah, actually, yeah. What is? Can someone from like the JS team just give a quick update on what is Shandong and what's in there?
Yeah, sure. Holger here from the JavaScript team. Yes, I'm always live thinking all the time here along these discussions how the Shandong testnet might fit in here a bit. Yes, Shandong is actually it's kind of a bit of a small experiment from the JavaScript team. So Marius once tweeted about kind of like the more or less settled Shanghai ERPs, and then we had all these implemented and thought that it might be a good occasion to test our client implementation and set up a small test net on this. And then we made a cooperation with EF DevOps and set up this Shandong testnet. And yeah, and in the Shandong testnet, we actually have these two EOF EIPs added, so 3540 and 3670, and then these other kind of like settled CFI EIPs like warm Coinbase and Push Zero and limit and meter init code EIPs. Yes, and again, this is kind of like a small testnet experiment balloon, and we launched this kind of like 2 weeks ago, and we had to restart it yesterday because of some actually EOF bugs. Yeah, and it's running pretty well, and yeah, it's kind of like Nethermind wanted to join as well, or did join as well. They're syncing as well, and yeah, that's kind of like our contribution with some small experiments. If there's maybe some space for hard fork testnets, which fill in a bit in the gap of this long time period where we actually don't have testnets because a hard fork is not yet settled.
Nice. And I guess, yeah, would it be valuable to try and activate the like 2 or 3 missing EOF heaps on that as well? Or I guess like Ansgar was saying, it might not be enough time to actually generate insights and like tweak them and whatnot.
Yeah, so we are relatively flexible with these kind of testnet setups. I already thought it might be a way kind of like that we stay a bit on board here if this turns out to be like accepted by the community and somewhat successful. And yeah, this might kind of like be a testnet series that we do where we really try to reflect kind of like the current situation of the state of the discussion in the Codex calls or so that we kind of like restart with such a testnet every 8 to 10 weeks or so, and just loosen from the hard fork, just put in the EIPs which are kind of like probable to get included in the next 1 or 2 hard forks. So that might be a way to go with these testnets.
Got it. Thanks. Andrew, you have your hand up.
Yeah, to my mind, we need 3 testnets. One is for withdrawals and the smaller EAPs that go into Shanghai, like warm code base, push zero, limited meter init code, right? So like about 4 EAPs in Shanghai, maybe plus potentially self-destruct. And the other 2 testnets would be EAP 4844 and EOF, because we don't know yet whether EAP 4844 will go into Shanghai or not, and the same for EOF.
Right. I guess if we do that, right, if we split in like 3 test nets, then how much work is it to like merge things? So say, we have these 3 test nets, withdrawals and the small EIPs is kind of like the basic Shanghai, like for sure it's going to happen. Then if we have this EOF test net and this 4844 test net, and we want to merge like 1 and 3 or 1 and 2 or 1 and 2 and 3, how much extra work does that create for us? Peter?
Yeah, so with regard to the testnets, I think it's more like having a separate, I think the idea is that everybody agrees withdrawals and the small stuff should go in. So that's kind of a sanity check that that the base of the hard fork is complete, and then the other two testnets I think would be just these proof of concept things, so that everybody's kind of on the same page. And does it work? Doesn't it work? And if it works, then we would probably end up with creating a combo testnet or something. So I think the idea of these multiple testnets is just to sanity check how people's implementations are, and just to help us decide what to ship. And then whenever we decide, okay, we're going, the final list of the IPs will be X, then we just either launch a last testnet, temporary testnet with those changes, everything included, or yeah, I think that would be the thing.
And I guess one thing that would be nice with that, so like the CL folks were saying that 4844 is being built on top of Capella. I assume this means that if we had this, like, call it minimal Shanghai testnet, which is basically this, what's in Shandong now, but it might be even less than what's in Shandong, because if you say you remove the EOF EIPs, then I assume that withdrawal testnet could interop with the Capella testnets on the CL side. Is that correct? And we could like start testing withdrawals ASAP, basically. And I know, Alex Stokes, you've been thinking about this. I don't know if this makes sense.
Yeah, wait, sorry, you want to add withdrawals to Shandong?
Right, yeah, I guess, don't think of it, let's not anchor it to Shandong, but like say we had a test net that has on the EL side withdrawals and then all these other small EIPs, push zero, limit meter init code and whatnot, not EOF, not 4844, that can interop with the Capella testnet on the CL side, correct?
Right. Yeah. So I want to get to withdrawals testnet, and if there's a few other sort of quote smaller EVM things, those are fine.
Yeah. So I guess, I don't know, my rough proposal to move forward would be, and also like, because client teams have said like it's really valuable to get some clarity on what to focus on. Should we move withdrawals and like these small EIPs to be fully included to Shanghai, leave EOF as CFI? I don't know what to do about 4844, but then focus on getting this testnet that's running withdrawals along with all these small EIPs on the EL side, and then just withdrawals on the CL side. Have that across all clients. Then in parallel, we can work on the 4844 devnets like we've been doing already. I think on the EOF side, there's clearly like at least this desire to try and get the whole thing. So I don't know if it's realistic if there's enough resources, I guess, across some client teams to come up with like an EOF, like a full EOF devnet basically as well. And so if in the next month we could sort of trial those two things, we might be in a good spot to then see, okay, what's actually involved with 4844, what's actually involved for EOF. But know that like we already have this core stuff moving into Shanghai. Yeah, I'm curious, does anyone have like an objection to that?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so would you suggest that we actually add withdrawals to our Shandong testnet and then also remove the EOF stuff?
Basically, yes. If it's Shandong, it can be another testnet because I imagine it might get complicated to just tweak that. But yes, what I would suggest is we move basically the warm Coinbase EIP, the push 01, limiting and metering init code, and then the withdrawals. We move them all to included for Shanghai. We start working on a devnet which has those 4 EIPs. In parallel, we can have another devnet that supports basically full EOF. So to try and see what's like a version of EOF that we could ship and not then worry about having to upgrade the version really quickly. And then in parallel, there's already all this work happening on the 4844 devnet, so we can keep working on that. And just from like code management perspective, we would assume that like both the EOF devnets and the 4844 devnets kind of build on this, call it Shanghai core implementations.
That sounds good to me, Tim.
Yeah. Okay, so no objections there. So I'll move those to included. And then, yeah, I think on the next call, okay, Marius zoned out. Sounds good. He'll realize Monday morning what he signed up for, so that's good. And I think, okay, so I'll move those EIPs to included. I think on the next call, when we have all of the kind of other EIPs come on as well, we can maybe make a decision about like, do we want to CFI 4844? Do we want to CFI more of the EOF stuff? And then, if we have some better data on self-destruct or also like 1153 and BLS, we can discuss all of those on the next call. But at least for client teams, I think it's clear that like getting started on withdrawals makes sense. And then, looking into EOF, looking into 4844 and seeing if we can kind of make progress on those to get them in a good spot for Shanghai seems like a good next step. The other thing I think that's worth starting a discussion on now for Shanghai is how do we want to think about fork activation? So we discussed this a little bit at DevCon. Basically, the idea is that EAT68. We'll do EAT68 after. I doubt we can finish the activation discussion anyways today, but just so people are aware, basically, if we choose kind of the CL side activates using an epoch, which is cleanly mapped to a timestamp, because time and epochs just like map together well. On proof of work, we would use block numbers. There was a big drift there. With upgrades like withdrawals, we want to ideally coordinate when they happen on both sides. So you want withdrawals to activate on the CL and then immediately be credited on the EL. Otherwise, you get a bunch of weird complexity. So I guess I'm curious to hear from teams, like what do they think is the best way to deal with fork activation? One obvious candidate is to move from using block numbers to timestamps on the EL, but there's a bunch of weird edge cases that pop up because of that. So it's worth, I guess when we're thinking about like planning Shanghai, this is something where if we need to change the activation procedure as well, it does add some work. Yeah, so I'm curious to hear from client teams, like what did they think about that and what do they see as like the best option for activation?
So we had a discussion about it in Bogota, and I was the only execution layer person there, and so the consensus layer teams kind of convinced me. I did implement.
To be clear, they convinced you of timestamps being the activation.
Sorry, yeah, they convinced me of timestamps. Yeah. I also implemented Shanghai forking based on timestamps on the execution layer, which was possible. There are a few questions or like a few things that can come up. The fork ID one is we can just use the timestamp as next fork to calculate the fork ID. So that's pretty easy. The more interesting things or the more interesting questions for execution layer clients are around retrieving stuff by block number. Basically, right now, before you retrieve a transaction by a block by block number or receipt by block number, you know which rules to apply. But after this, we don't know which rules to apply to the thing that we just got either from the network or from the database. And we would need to read the header of the block first. Or we would need to access. So if we were to change something in the receipts based on a fork, we would need to always fetch the header first to see if the header by number first to see which rules to apply to the receipts. It's not a problem right now, but it might be a problem for other clients. So it's not a problem right now for Geth, but it might be a problem for other clients.
Oh, Peter?
Just to add, essentially, I guess the reason is that when you retrieve a receipt, a transaction, or any other stuff from the RPC, currently you do not get back the block timestamp. You only get back the block hash and the block number. So if you want to check which fork this happened, then you would need to do an additional fetch. However, in this case, I mean, we could, if timestamp all of a sudden becomes a fork discriminator, then we could add the timestamp to the result of these requests, and then you still have the same amount of information. So that part is normal.
So I guess, is there something less worse than this basically to consider? My feeling is this obviously introduces complexity, but there's not really a better alternative. Does anyone have like a strong disagreement with that? If not,
my 2 cents is that there are probably things that you might not see. I think it's a good enough idea that we should maybe just try to roll with it and see if anybody finds something frustrating.
Yeah. And I guess, is it worth having a sort of EIP or meta EIP, I don't know, to define this so that like clients, because I understand there's like two parts of it. One is like the activation, but two is like the implementation details, which might vary by client. But is there some part of it that we want to standardize, kind of like EIP 21, 24, but not quite?
I mean, standardized seems a bit much, but maybe just have a document which highlights that, okay, once we switch over to timestamps, take care of API method A, API method B, and API method C because they need some extra love.
Got it.
Yeah, so we should standardize JSON RPC, right? So
right. Okay.
I think we should make those changes explicit that if someone uses it, can count of those being there.
Okay. And I guess, so if this is the route we're going, I think we should probably implement that in, sorry, this like minimal Shanghai DevNet, so that like we basically assume it forks on the timestamp and go from there. And I think this is roughly what people have been doing in existing DevNets already. So does that make sense to people? And then once we have like a first DevNet or two, we'll probably know exactly how we want to change JSON RPC, and we can open PRs for that. But yeah, does it make sense for this first like withdrawals and small EIP DevNets to use timestamps, and we can go from there? Oh, Peter?
So I guess one interesting quirk could be that if I set up a Genesis for a testnet, Genesis spec, then essentially every previous hard fork I would need to define with block numbers, and then this one would be defined, and maybe future ones would be defined via timestamps. If the previous forks are not all aggregated into block 0, then I can imagine a scenario where essentially if you say that, okay, London will happen in block number 10, but the timestamp of block number 1 already puts us into Shanghai 6, a weird scenario.
Right.
So there's definitely unexpected weirdness that can happen if people just reuse the same Genesis as. So currently you can just reuse the same private network Genesis for your own testing purposes. And with timestamps, people need to be aware that you actually need to change your Genesis every time you spin up a new network.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's where. I for the DevNet, I feel like we can just have like 10 minutes or whatever be the trigger or something like that. But I agree. Yeah, that's an edge case we should document somewhere. I'm not sure where though. Okay, so just because, okay, we only have 4 minutes left and there's 2 more things I think we should really try and cover. So EAT68 by Marius and then Gordy. There's a separate call to talk about Gordy, but at least give Afri a minute or 2 to kind of share it so that folks who are interested can show up and discuss that. Marius, EAT68.
Yes. So ETH68 is the newest version to the ETH protocol. And it basically, we have 2 ways of sending transactions. We have a broadcast and we have an announce retrieve scheme. You announce the transaction hashes that you have, and the other person can fetch the transactions from you. For blobs, for 4844, we don't want people to broadcast these transactions because this will increase the load on the network quite a bit, and so we want to not have them broadcasted and only have them via the announcements. But we would like to have ETH68, which adds the transaction type and the transaction size to the announcement. Basically, you're announcing the transaction hash, the transaction type, and the transaction size. And so your peer can choose which transactions to fetch. It is written in a way that it can be implemented and rolled out right now. So like it helps us in the future with 4844, but we can roll it out right now. And yes, we would like to roll it out as soon as possible so that we have a lot of people moving over to 68 as soon as possible.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, just to add to that, the single denial of service vector that we've seen on the execution client side for 4844 is that these block transactions are kind of large. In Bogota, we're talking about 128K transactions, and broadcasting them to square root number of peers means that on the order of magnitude, you will pass the same transaction across every link 7 times or more. And so every peer will get a lot of duplicates. And when transactions are a few kilobytes, that's not relevant. But when you have these larger transactions, you really don't want them to be broadcast more than once. And this announce mechanism simply allows us to say that, okay, if it's a block transaction, then we're just going to announce it. So we guarantee that it will every single peer will at max retrieve it once. So it's kind of like the optimal network bandwidth usage. The cost is that latency-wise, it will be ever so slightly slower, but I think that's perfectly reasonable for block transactions that you don't get thousands of transactions per second, rather you just have a few. So being the block transactions, it makes them a bit special, and you can this protocol extension allows you to handle it specially and decide how you want to handle it.
Got it. Okay, we're already at time. Sorry. There was one other thing I skipped over on the agenda. We're obviously not going to have time to discuss it today, but I would encourage people to review it async, and we can cover this on the CL call because it's relevant there as well. But basically, this proposal to add the block value in response to the get payload call in the engine API, and this would help basically validators compare local blocks with blocks provided by third-party relays, which is something that we've been talking a lot about lately. So I posted the issue in the chat. I think if people want to review this before the next CL call next week, that would be great, and we can discuss it in more details there. And then lastly, just before we wrap up, Afri, do you want to give a quick rundown on what's happening on Gordy and the call that you have scheduled next week to discuss this?
Yes, thank you. I keep it very short. So Gurley is in a really complicated situation due to the supply issues. It's currently easier to buy Gurley than to get it from a faucet, which is not the way it is supposed to work. So I created a discussion with potential ways out of the situation on the Ethereum Magicians forums. It's linked in the PM thread. Please click on it if this is important for you. And I have scheduled a community call next week where we can discuss paths out of this situation in detail. And yeah, I would not underestimate this because this will affect not only infrastructure providers and application developers, but also might impact our work for protocol engineering and testing. So if you could spend some time to dig into this thread and maybe join the call next Tuesday at 3 p.m. UTC, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been kind of weird on Gordy recently. Anyone have final thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Okay. Yeah, thank you, everyone. I think, yeah, we had a lot of good conversations today. I'll make an update to the Shanghai spec. And then for anyone listening on the next call, we'll try to cover a bunch of other potential proposals for Shanghai. So if you have something that you feel really strongly about, next week or 2 weeks from now is the time to show up. Yeah, and then I think if the EOF people and 4844 people can also show up 2 weeks from now, we'll probably want to continue those conversations as well. But in the meantime, yeah, for client teams, withdrawals and these other small Shanghai EIPs are probably the most solid thing to be focusing on. Yeah, thanks a ton, everybody.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.